As the Albert-Bapaume Road takes you through the heart of the old Somme battlefields, you cross over the Pozières Ridge, and over to your left is a small village, the village of Courcelette. Here in 1916 the men of the Canadian Corps fought their first attack of the Great War. And here was once my home, where I lived, on the old front line. This week we return to the Somme. For this 25th episode of the Old Front Line, we're back in my spiritual homeland of the Somme, and quite literally in a place where I used to live, the village of Courcelette. Courcelette is a village right in the heart of the Somme battlefields. It was swept up in the German advance of 1914, and for nearly the next 2 years it became a base for units of the 26th Reserve Division. This was a Württemberg unit based around Stuttgart, and many of the troops from that region who served on the Somme passed through Courcelette, going to and from the frontline areas at La Boisselle and Overlers and Chapval. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, as the fighting raged along the front line around Albert, German heavy artillery units were here assisting in the defence of the positions in this central part of the Somme battlefields. And then 2 months into the battle, on the 15th of September 1916, in what became known as the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, the Canadian Corps under Lieutenant General Sir Julian Byng attacked the village. This was the first time the Canadian Corps had taken part in an attack in the Great War. The Canadian divisions had been brought together to form this corps. Up until this point, they'd been pretty much either on the defensive or just holding the line. This was their first attack, and Courcelette was the first village liberated by Canadian troops in the First World War, so it's quite significant from that point of view. Because it was a French village, when the village was cleared on the 15th September, the battalion that was given the task to do that was the 22nd, the Vendus, the French Canadians, and they fought their way through the village, clearing out the Germans in the cellars of the houses here, using what the Canadians described as pea-bombs, which were phosphorus hand grenades thrown down into the close confines of the cellars, meaning there was very little chance of escape for the Germans within. With the village captured, the Canadians pushed on to the far side, dug in beneath the ridge that barred the way to the villages of Grandcourt and Miramont beyond, utilised the sunken lane to the eastern side of the village and dug in just beyond that, and from here the fighting continued in late September on into the attacks of October until the fighting around Courcelette ended on the 18th November 1916, right at the end of the Battle of the Somme, with the capture of Desire Trench and some of the ground beyond. By that time, all 4 Canadian divisions of the Canadian Corps had been employed here, which meant that men from every part of Canada had taken part in the fighting around the village of Courcelette. 24,000 of them had become casualties, of which 8,500 were killed in action. For a small battlefield like this, it was one of the heaviest tolls that the Canadians suffered in the Great War. And of that 8,500 dead, over 6,000 of them were missing. Their bodies were never recovered from the battlefield, and Courcelette, like many places on the Somme, is still giving up those secrets, still giving up its ghosts, more than a century later. I lived in Courcelette for over a decade, and when you live in the space that was the old front line, it changes your perspective of what these battlefields are, what they mean. You connect to them in a very different way. Each morning I would wake up to the sounds and the smells of the battlefield as it is now, to the birds singing across the fields, to the silence at night, when the old battlefield seemed empty and quiet. But when you stood there, somehow you were not alone, and the noise was terrific, the past calling to you. And I think that's how many of us who visit these battlefields connect. This is not just a moment in time that's elapsed. It's still vivid, it's still there somehow, and it speaks through the beacons that mark the old front line, the cemeteries, the memorials, the fields where all these things took place. And living here, of course, people would knock on the door and they'd report the discovery of human remains in the fields of soldiers lost in the Great War, some of those 6,000 Canadians who disappeared at Courcelette. Or they'd find something in the fields and be curious to know what it was, whether that was a German shell case from where the gun batteries were once established, a British helmet, or a bit of a tank. But living here and walking this ground so often and having an intimate knowledge of it, one of the things, of course, that you see is change. how things are built, how fields are ploughed, how trees are cut down, and the battlefield gradually changes, evolves, and becomes different. And at Courcelette I've seen all of that. Bits of the old front line that once were so prominent have now gone, and that's mirrored right across different parts of the Western Front. But we'll start our walk today right in the heart of the village. This is one of a number of walks that we'll do together at Courcelette. We're standing just outside the church. Over to our left is the village war memorial. There are some Canadian memorial plaques there as well, to some of the Canadian units that fought at Courcelette in 1916. The little triangle of ground surrounded by brick where there's trees and a little bus shelter, that was the village pond before the First World War. Courcelette was razed to the ground. It was one of those villages awarded the Croix de Guerre because it was completely destroyed as part of the Zone Rouge. The Croix de Guerre used to be on a pillow in the town hall here, and I suspect it's still in there somewhere. When the people of Courcelette came back in 1919, they lived in the old cellars, they salvaged a few Nissen huts, and eventually the village was rebuilt, pretty much on the same layouts as the pre-war village. Where we are now, there's a big brick barn just behind us, just on the other side of the road from where the war memorial is. And when you look at the German photographs of that from 1915, it's almost identical. Most of the houses here were rebuilt in 1922 and 1923. The house I lived in here at Courcelette had delivery dates on the wooden beams that form part of the roof, which indicated that they were brought in the summer of 1923. So I suspect that many of the buildings here were rebuilt about that time. Some of them on the site of existing buildings, but others were so badly smashed that they couldn't be rebuilt in the same place, or were not rebuilt at all, as we discover in the case of one of the chateaux that was here at Courcelette later in this walk. So with the church on our right, we'll walk down a little road that takes us between the church, between a big farm on the right and the war memorial on our left, down Rue Boileau. And there's a little house just up on the left-hand side where, depending on the time of year, you might see some examples of some of the old brick cellar entrances that existed here in Courcelette. Most of them have disappeared now, but there are some here. Continuing down the road, we'll take the first road on our right, past the little 1920s cottage on the left, up towards some modern houses where in front of them, to our left, is a bit of open ground, and a telegraph pole and some telegraph lines going down the hill ahead of us. If you look carefully in this field, it is a mound, and on that mound was a chateau, what we called the Red Chateau because it was probably built out of brick. It was owned by Monsieur Proyard, who had two chateaux on the Somme, one here at Courcelette and another one at Combles, on the far side of the Somme battlefields from where we are now. Back in the 1990s, when my mother came to visit one year, she walked in this field and she found a little name plaque from a box that once was owned by Monsieur Proyard with his name on, and that was the first time I think that we had an indication of the name of the person who once lived here. He was a wealthy Parisian, and when he came back to see both of his chateaux in 1919, he found them smashed to oblivion by the bombardments and graves in the grounds of both of them. There was a cemetery here at the Red Chateau, a Canadian cemetery from 1916 and a German one from earlier than that. So for whatever reason, he decided never to have either of them rebuilt. So the one here at Courcelette and his other one at Combles were never rebuilt after the war. The Red Chateau here was renowned for its cellars. It had huge vaulted cellars, and in 1916, during the fighting here when the Canadians were attacking around Courcelette, this was one of the main medical reception areas for wounded coming back from the front line on this side of the village. Canon Frederick Scott, who I've mentioned in quite a few podcasts, was here as a padre with the Royal Montreal Regiment, and many other famous Canadians passed through here, including Talbot Papineau, Will Bird, who wrote the book Ghosts Have Warm Hands, Jock Fraser, whose Journal of Private Fraser is a classic account of a Canadian infantryman in the First World War, and Victor Wheeler, who wrote the excellent No Man's Land about the 50th Battalion in World War I. But as I mentioned, there were also German burials here. They'd used the chateau as a headquarters and also a base for their own medical units, so soldiers wounded in the front line at places like Overlers and Thiepval were brought back here for treatment. Some of them, just like our soldiers, died of their wounds and they were buried here, and also in the communal cemetery, which we're going to visit very shortly. These graves appear to have been moved to Vermandovilliers after the First World War, although there is no list of the men that were once buried here. So from here we'll continue along this street until it gets to the main road. We're at the far end of one of the sunken lanes at Courcelette, one captured by the Canadians on the first day of the battle. As we get to this junction with the old quarry ahead of us to our left, very much reduced now. I mentioned that how things disappeared, and this is one of them that was redeveloped a few years ago by one of the farmers in the village. And the original layout of the quarry, which is pretty much unchanged since 1916, was sadly redeveloped out of all recognition. So we'll carefully cross the roads, and there's a little ramp path that takes us up into the communal cemetery here, and we'll go on in. This is the post-war communal cemetery for Courcelette, the original burials from before the war. None of those survived the bombardments of 1916. Courcelette was a moonscape even in that year, but by the end of the war, absolutely nothing remained here. The Germans added an extension onto this just to the left, and up until a few years ago, you could see some examples of the brickwork around the edge of where that extension was, sadly now removed. The only reminder of the German cemetery that was once here, which may well have contained nearly 1,000 German graves, is a single headstone which we can see lying flat just across to our left. My daughter Poppy, who still lives in Courcelette, has adopted this headstone with the permission of the mayor and cleaned it up in recent months. It's quite an ornate grave, and despite that it shows some signs of some battle damage, it reads, "My dear brother, Hermann Mayer, Lieutenant and Company Leader from Stuttgart, served in the 121st Infantry Regiment and fell on the 5th of December 1914 near Thiepval." Again, this soldier is now buried in Vermandovilliers German Cemetery, so it seems that his grave was removed from here, but there is a widespread belief within Courcelette that the field just adjacent to where the civilian cemetery is now still contains the graves of possibly many hundreds of German soldiers who died in the period before the Battle of the Somme, were buried in proper graves, quite deep, possibly in coffins, and whose remains will never naturally come to the surface. It would require excavation to recover them, but I think the chances of that happening are pretty remote. There are no war graves within this communal cemetery, although there is the grave of a French poilu, a French soldier who was killed on the Chemin des Dames. There's a rough wooden cross on the right with an oval ceramic photograph of him, and I'll put a picture of this on the website so you can see it, oldfrontline.co.uk. But if you go to the back of the cemetery, there is a headstone that looks like a Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstone, and this is the grave of a Commonwealth War Graves Commission gardener. It's Frank Haywood. He died in Courcelette on the 20th of December 1936. He'd been a gardener for some time, and during the Great War had served in the South Downs battalions of the Royal Sussex Regiment and had fought nearby at Thiepval and in the fighting for Stuff Redoubt. He's one of a number of war graves gardeners whose graves like this that you'll find scattered across not just the Somme battlefields, but the entire British sector of the Western Front. Leaving the cemetery, we'll go back down the little slope and then turn right onto the cart track that takes you out into the fields. We'll continue for a little way till it reaches a high point, then we'll stop and look to our left. Behind us now is the Albert-Bapaume Road, Bapaume to our half right and Albert to our half left. There's a valley in front of us now, and this area was marked on the trench maps as the North and South practice trenches. So what was here was a set of just that, practice trenches that the Germans had dug in the months and the years before the Battle of the Somme to train their troops on trench warfare, trench raiding, assaults, holding the line, because this was then, of course, some miles behind the front line. It was safe to have a training ground like this. When the Canadians took this ground, there was a battle for it in the days that followed the capture of the village, and then it formed part of the Canadian line as the push then moved forward towards the next defensive line the Germans constructed, which was Regina Trench, the longest German trench on the Western Front, that ran from near Thiepval right across behind Courcelette over towards the next village of Le Sart. The cart track does a dogleg a little bit further up, and we'll follow it down the hill into the valley. When we get to the bottom of the valley, we can see that it's dead ground here, that you can't be seen from the surrounding ground up towards Miramont ahead of you, Grandcourt over to your left, and the German positions that would have been around Le Sars now over to our extreme right. And that meant that towards the end of the Battle of the Somme, in the final push for the fighting around Regina Trench and Desire Trench in October and November, the Canadian field artillery were able to move their field guns, their 18-pounders, up into this valley. And when you walk it in the winter, occasionally you do find some evidence of that. Discarded shell cases flattened by the tractor, or some of the little crosses that you find that go on the base of the 18-pounder shells that protect the shell when it's moved up. That sort of field archaeology where you walk the ground and you see the artefacts that are there does give you a good indication of the use and some of the things that happened in fields like this on the Somme and other parts of the Western Front. So we'll turn left, we'll follow our way out of the valley back towards the main road. We'll then turn right and go up that main road. As we come out of the far side of Courcelette and the area where the chateau was on our left, there's a little bit of a stream here that passes under the road, and in the winter months the stream to the left in that field can often flood. In the late 90s that was dug out, and the bodies of 2 Canadian soldiers were found there from the 31st Alberta Regiment, and we'll discuss the story of one of those when we get to ADANAC Cemetery fairly shortly. We'll continue along this road now that eventually comes to the village of Miramont, and it will take us up onto the high open fields around the village of Courcelette. It's when you come to places like this you can see how wide and open some of these Somme landscapes are. And you've got to picture this in 1916, completely devoid of any cover. So in the early Canadian attacks across this ground up towards Regina Trench, a trench built when this was behind the German lines, so with no opposition to try and stop the work that they were doing. The Germans could build exactly what they want, where they wanted. They sited it absolutely perfectly. So as those early Canadian attacks came up this rise towards the trench, they were annihilated by German machine gun and shell fire, and the Canadians, particularly in early October 1916, suffered greatly in this part of the battlefield. Eventually we'll come to the cemetery just up on the right hand side, and we'll open the gates and head on into ADANAC Military Cemetery. ADANAC Military Cemetery actually sits in the commune of Miramont, which is the next village if we continued along this road up over the hill ahead of us. But when we turn round and look back towards Courcelette, we see that actually it's nearer to that village, and it overlooks the battlefields around Courcelette where the fighting took place in 1916, involving men of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the Canadian Corps. So the name ADANAC is Canada spelt backwards, so that's how this cemetery gets its name. There was actually only one burial here during the war, which is now incorporated into the cemetery, but it was a site that was selected after the war to make a main concentration cemetery for this area. So from 1919 onwards, the battlefields around Courcelette and Miramont and this side of the Ancre Valley were cleared, and the burials were moved to here. Although in addition to this immediate area, there are, for example, burials from the fighting around High Wood in here, and also New Zealanders from the fighting towards Bapaume around the village of Grevillers, which is not that far from where we are now. More of one of those in a little while. So when the cemetery was made permanent, the number of graves here totaled 1,973 British graves, 1,071 Canadians, 70 New Zealanders, 53 Australians, 5 whose unit was unknown, and 1 German. Of these, 1,712 were unnamed, so the majority of them, and there were 13 special memorials of men known to be buried amongst them. So when we walk round this cemetery, we see a lot of maple leaves. When we inspect the graves, they are unknown Canadian soldiers whose bodies were found on this battlefield after the war. We spoke about the 6,000 Canadian missing for Courcelette. Those men are not commemorated on the Thiepval Memorial, which we can see in the distance from here. They are on the Vimy Memorial, which is Canada's memorial to the missing for 11,000 men who died in France between 1915 and the end of the war and have no known grave. But half of those names at Vimy are men who died in the fields around where you're standing now. And of the unknown Canadians buried in here, whoever they are, and we'll never know, their names will be on the Vimy Memorial. Sadly, the nature of the Canadian attacks here in 1916, particularly in October, when they were advancing for the first time on Regina Trench, was that wave after wave of men went forward, were cut to pieces in no man's land. The bodies lay out on the battlefield in quite a small area. There was a lot of concentrated shell fire, and the bodies really became part of the battlefield. So in the post-war period, when it was cleared, there was virtually no chance of identifying these men, and in many cases of ever finding them. Now, like many cemeteries on the Western Front where there are the graves of men awarded the Victoria Cross, people do like to come and visit those graves, and there are 2 Victoria Cross recipients buried in this cemetery, one of whom ties to the location where we're standing now. Regina Trench ran very close to where we are, And in one of the attacks there on the 9th of October 1916, the 16th Battalion Canadian Infantry, the Canadian Scottish, made an assault up from the north and south practice trenches where we were earlier, up the slope towards where the cemetery is, and came under intensive fire from the German trenches. There was a lot of uncut wire, and one of their pipers, being a Canadian Scottish unit, was James Cleland Richardson. Now, he was only a young lad. He was only 20 years old. He'd been born in Bellshill in Lanarkshire in Scotland. Like many young men, particularly from Scotland, had emigrated to Canada before the war in hope of fortune, of fame, to find a living there, whatever the reasons were. And like many, when the war broke out, perhaps that quite had not happened, and the war was a way to escape. So he enlisted, he joined the Canadian Scottish, and here in the attack on Regina Trench, he piped the men into action, and when they got to their objective and couldn't get in, he continued to pipe. He helped with the evacuation of some of the wounded, and then realised he'd left his pipes behind and went back for them and was never seen again, although his body was later found. He was subsequently awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross for his bravery, and his citation reads as follows: "For most conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty, when prior to an attack, he obtained permission from his commanding officer to play his company over the top. As the company approached the objective, it was held up by very strong wire and came under intensive fire, which caused heavy casualties and demoralised the formation for the moment. Realising the situation, Piper Richardson strode up and down outside the wire, playing his pipes with the greatest coolness. The effect was instantaneous. Inspired by his splendid example, the company rushed the wire with such fury and determination that the obstacle was overcome and the position captured. Later, after participating in bombing operations, he was detailed to take back a wounded comrade and prisoners. After proceeding about 200 yards, Piper Richardson remembered that he left his pipes behind. Although strongly urged not to do so, he insisted on returning to recover his pipes. He has never been seen since. Some time ago I read that Piper Richardson's bagpipes have now been found, and his story continues to inspire Canadians who travel to this cemetery, partly because of its name, but probably more so to visit the grave of this young piper and his inspired bravery here in 1916. We can also find here the grave of Sergeant Samuel Forsyth of the New Zealand Engineers. He served with No. 3 Field Company and was killed near Grevillers on the 24th of August 1918. One of the originals of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, he'd served at Gallipoli in 1915, where he contracted sickness and was lightly wounded, and then had fought in most of the New Zealand operations on the Western Front. He got his Victoria Cross when the unit that he was attached to came under heavy German machine gun fire, and he first led a reconnaissance to pinpoint where the machine guns were, then organised some tanks to help assist him in trying to silence those guns so the advance could continue. And at the last moment, just as victory was in their grasp, he was killed by a sniper. When you look at the grave of someone like Forsyth, who joined up at the very beginning of the war, and he dies in August 1918, almost exactly 4 years later, and only a few weeks, as we now know, from the end of the war. He'd served in 3 theatres of operations, Egypt, Gallipoli, and on the Western Front. He'd fought in all those battles, only to be killed in that final phase of the war. As we often say on this podcast, the cruel hand of war. And in addition, of course, he came quite literally from the other side of the world, which makes this sacrifice all the more remarkable in many ways. In 1998, when I was living at Courcelette, I heard from one of the farmers in the village that they had discovered the bodies of 2 soldiers in the little valley near to where Monsieur Proyart's chateau was. It was that little bit of ground where the flooded stream was as we walked up from the edge of Courcelette village to ADANAC Cemetery. When they looked at the remains of the 2 soldiers and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's chief exhumation officer came down, they found with the remains of one of the soldiers an aluminium identity disc, a dog tag, which was the type worn in 1916 by many Canadian soldiers. This identified him as Private J. MacArthur of the 31st Battalion Canadian Infantry, who'd been killed in this field on the 27th of September 1916, aged 36. As a missing soldier, his name had been added to the Vimy Memorial, but now, after all these years, he was found. So in November 1998, on the 80th anniversary of the end of the Great War, a party from Canada came here and they reburied Private MacArthur in the presence of 2 Canadian veterans who were, as far as I'm aware, the last two survivors of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Some of MacArthur's family was here, and this was one of many Great War soldiers' burials that I went to in the 1990s, men killed half a century before I was born. It was a remarkable experience to stand there and see those soldiers finally laid to rest, recovered from the past, no longer walking as ghosts across this battlefield, resting in peace alongside their comrades. And when you walk round this cemetery, it is in many respects a comrade cemetery. It's not called ADANAC Cemetery for nothing. This is the heart of Canada. Men from every part of that nation, from all sorts of different backgrounds, men who lived in the city, men who farmed, men who prospected for gold, adventurers, cowboys, railway workers. Canada was a young nation, and it needed men who could be inspired to do these amazing things, and many of those were equally inspired themselves to join up in 1914. I think all of that is how the Canadians saw themselves, and what in many respects, like other Commonwealth nations, felt put them apart from the ordinary Tommies that they encountered from Britain. In that final year of the war, the Canadians would go on to achieve so much, but here 2 years previously at Courcelette, this was really their true baptism of fire. This is where they began to learn the lessons of trench warfare, but lessons that came at a price. 24,000 Canadian casualties in the fields around you now in 1916. And as we walk along the rows and rows of Canadian headstones here, we can see visibly how costly that price was more than a century ago. Sitting on the cemetery wall at the back of ADANAC Cemetery, we can look out across the fields around Courcelette. It's open grounds, open and unforgiving even now. When I spent my first winter on the Somme in the 1990s, the temperature dropped dramatically. It was the coldest winter in many, many years. It went as low as -25, which is exactly what it had been during the winter of 1916-17, the coldest winter of the Great War, when in the trenches on the Ancre Heights here around Courcelette, men were exposed to those very same temperatures, -25. There was no Gore-Tex, no bivvy bags, no escape from this. The enemy was the elements, was the weather, and more men succumbed to that new enemy than the enemy on the other side of no man's land, the Germans. And the Germans, they were fighting the same battle, against the cold, against the snow, against the wet. It's hard for us to imagine men living in ditches in these open fields for months and months and months at a time. But they did, and it's part of that remarkable story of the Great War. And the echoes of that remarkable generation live on, here, across the fields of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Do take time to subscribe to us via your favourite podcast service. Tell us what you think using the hashtag OldFrontLine. You can follow me on Twitter at SommeCorps, and the podcast has its own Twitter feed now at OldFrontLinePod. And have a look at the podcast websites oldfrontline.co.uk. Until we meet again along the Old Front Line.